Why did four grown men believe they could corner her without consequence? Why did they think her silence meant weakness? The training gym was quiet that night, but what happened inside it would echo far beyond its walls. She wasn't supposed to stand out. She had built her cover carefully, a petite recruit with average numbers, quiet enough to blend in, disciplined enough to pass unnoticed. At 5'4", 125 pounds, Ella looked like the least threatening person in the room. And that was the point. But on the 18th night of training at Naval Station Great Lakes, her cover was about to be tested in a way she hadn't planned for. The gym smelled of iron and rubber mats, the clink of weights echoing faintly from the far side. Ella was working on pull-ups, her hands steady, breathing controlled. Every movement was precise, measured, deliberate. To anyone else, it looked like a recruit struggling to keep up, trying to meet the minimum strength standards. What no one knew was that she wasn't there to keep up. She was there to maintain the sharpened edge of skills that ordinary recruits never learned. The sound of laughter broke the rhythm of her set. Heavy footsteps followed. Four men entered, bigger, louder, already carrying the swagger of overconfidence. Petty Officer Tank Williams led the group, his frame blocking the fluorescent light above. 6'2", 240 pounds of muscle, a former wrestling champion. Behind him came Hammer Johnson, a boxer from Detroit whose fists had ended more than one street fight. Mike Bull Anderson, broad-shouldered and heavy, once a linebacker who lived for collisions. And Tony Crusher Martinez, built like a tree trunk, calloused hands from years in construction. They saw Ella alone, and in that moment their arrogance made a decision for them. "Well, well," Tank's voice carried across the room, mocking but confident. "Look who's trying to get swole." Ella dropped from the bar, turned, and gave a polite nod. "Evening." Hammer laughed. "Listen to that, so polite." They fanned out into a semicircle. To someone watching, it might not have looked threatening yet. But Ella had been in rooms where men circled like this before, not recruits, not classmates, but hostile forces who believed size and numbers guaranteed dominance. Her eyes flicked across their stances. Distance, weight distribution, exit routes. In less than 3 seconds, her mind had mapped every angle of the room. Tank smirked. "I've been watching you in training, struggling, barely finishing the courses. You sure this is your career path? Maybe aerobics would suit you better." Bull chuckled and added, "Yeah, sweetheart, you crush it in Zumba." She met their eyes one by one. "I appreciate the advice, but I'm committed to finishing the program." Crusher barked out a laugh. "Lady, commitment doesn't change biology. You're what? 120 pounds. I could bench press you." "Probably could," Ella said softly. "But is there something you need, or can I finish my workout?" Tank stepped closer. The air in the gym thickened, an unspoken shift in energy. "Actually, we thought you could use some personalized training." Hammer grinned. 4-on-1 training." The others laughed. Inside, Ella felt the quiet shift of something she knew too well. These weren't classmates anymore. Not tonight. Their body language, their positioning, their tone, all of it was edging toward escalation. She kept her breathing calm, her heart steady, but she had already made a decision. If they closed the circle fully, if they tried to put their hands on her, she would break cover. She hadn't wanted this. Her mission was evaluation, not confrontation. But sometimes the only way out was through. Her voice was low, calm. "That's generous of you, but I prefer to train alone." Tank leaned in, close enough for her to smell the sweat on his shirt. "See, that's the problem. You think you can do this alone, but in the military you learn your place. You learn when you're outmatched." The circle tightened. To anyone else it would look like 4 predators closing in on a target, but to Ella it was just a geometry problem. Angles, vectors, timing. She had been trained for this exact scenario: confined space, multiple opponents, no backup. Bull cracked his knuckles. "Maybe we should show her what teamwork looks like." That was it, the final signal. The moment she knew there would be no easy way out. She straightened her shoulders. Her voice didn't waver. "I'll ask you once more. Let me finish my workout and leave." Tank smirked. "Or what? You'll tell the drill instructors. Cry about how 4 big mean men scared you." "No," her eyes narrowed. "I'll do what I was trained to do when outnumbered by hostile forces." For the first time their confidence wavered. Hammer frowned. "What did you just say?" Ella's voice cut the air like a blade. "I said I was trained for this exact situation. Multiple opponents, confined space, no backup. Would you like a demonstration?" The gym fell into silence. Bull snorted and stepped forward. "You threatening us?" "I'm offering you an opportunity," she replied evenly, "to walk away before this becomes a lesson you don't forget." But arrogance has a way of blinding judgment. Tank nodded at Bull. "Grab her arms. Let's see how tough she talks when she can't move." Time slowed. Ella's world narrowed. She had been in war zones, in alleys where the wrong choice meant death, in where betrayal could erupt without warning. She had learned that hesitation was fatal. The instant Bull reached for her, she moved. His hand never closed around her arm. She twisted, catching his wrist, using his own momentum to spin him down. His shoulder locked, his body slammed face first onto the mat. A stunned gasp left his lungs before his brain even processed the fall. Crusher lunged. She ducked low, pivoted, her elbow driving into his solar plexus. Air rushed from his chest, his body folding like paper. Hammer swung a heavy fist. She redirected, a quick strike to the nerve cluster that made his entire arm go limp. He stared at his hand in disbelief, his weaponized fist suddenly useless. Tank, the self-proclaimed champion, moved last. His size should have been his advantage, but size means nothing against precision. In seconds, he was flat on his back, her knee pressing into his chest, his arm bent at an angle that made pain shoot through his body. 43 seconds. That's how long it took. 4 men, all trained, all larger, all confident, neutralized before they could understand what happened. Bull groaned from the floor. "Holy, what the hell are you?" Ella looked down at Tank, still pinned beneath her. Her voice stayed calm. "I'm someone trained to handle situations like this. Are we done? Or do you want a more advanced demonstration?" Tank shook his head quickly, his bravado gone. "We're done. We're definitely done." She released him, rose smoothly, and picked up her towel. The 4 men staggered upright, nursing bruises, their pride shattered. Their eyes were filled with something new: fear, confusion, respect. Before they could speak, she cut them off. "Yes, you just got taken down by someone half your size. No, it wasn't luck. And yes, I could hurt you far worse if I wanted to, but I didn't. Now think carefully before you decide what you'll do with this memory." She slung the towel over her shoulder and turned toward the door. The gym was silent, their laughter replaced with the sound of their own breathing. As she reached the exit, she paused, her voice drifting back to them. "Strength doesn't mean intimidation. It means protecting people. Remember that." She walked out, her footsteps echoing, leaving 4 men staring at one another, no longer laughing. They had no idea who she really was. They had no idea why she was there, or what kind of training could turn someone her size into a storm of precision and control. But one thing was certain: they would never underestimate her again. And deep down, Ella knew something else. The mission she was sent here for, quiet, hidden, meant only for classified reports, had just collided with something far more human. Sometimes change didn't come from regulations or instructors or policy. Sometimes it began with a single moment when arrogance met truth. And the truth tonight was simple: she was not to be underestimated. Why didn't she report them? That was the question burning in their minds the next morning. 4 men who had swaggered into the gym with jokes and arrogance now sat at breakfast tables in silence, avoiding her eyes, replaying those 43 seconds again and again. They had felt her strength. Not brute strength, but something sharper, something that cut past muscle and bravado. It unsettled them more than the pain still lingering in their joints. Tank rubbed his shoulder absent-mindedly, staring at his tray. Hammer flexed his hand, amazed that he could feel his fingers again. Bull and Crusher ate quietly, a shadow of last night's humiliation hanging over them. Across the room, Ella sat alone the same way she always did, calm, head down, a tray of eggs and toast like everyone else. She didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge them. It was almost as if nothing had happened. Almost. Tank swallowed hard, leaned closer to his friends. "She's not normal," he muttered. "No kidding," Bull whispered. "I still can't breathe right." Crusher scowled, lowering his voice. "You realize what we did, right? If she tells anyone." The table went quiet because they all knew. If she reported them, the fallout could be catastrophic. 4 men cornering a woman after hours in a gym. Intimidation, harassment, assault. Careers ended before they began. Disgrace, discharge. Hammer wiped his mouth, his voice uneasy. "Then why hasn't she? Why didn't she go straight to the instructors?" Tank stared at her across the room. She was cutting her toast into small, precise squares, eating slowly. Not scared, not angry, just steady. And that frightened him more than anything else. Because fear would have been expected. Anger too. But calm meant control. Calm meant she had nothing to prove to them. Ella, meanwhile, felt the weight of her decision pressing on her chest like an invisible stone. She could have reported them. By every rule of her assignment, she should have. 4 men had created a hostile environment, exactly the kind of behavior she'd been tasked with observing. She could have written it into her classified report, named names, recommended disciplinary action. But that wasn't what she'd done. She'd chosen another path, a quieter one. As she chewed, she replayed the night, the way Bull's eyes widened as his body hit the floor, the shock on Crusher's face when the air left his lungs, the disbelief in Hammer's eyes as his arm went numb, the panic in Tank's voice when his confidence collapsed beneath her knee. She had seen it before in war zones, in alley fights, in secret briefings where egos clashed against reality. People who thought they understood strength until the truth shattered their illusions. She hadn't hurt them, not really. She could have, but she hadn't, because this wasn't about victory, it was about choice. Her mission required observation, analysis, silence. But sometimes silence wasn't enough. Sometimes teaching a lesson meant stepping into the fire and risking exposure. She lowered her fork, exhaled quietly. No one in this chow hall knew who she really was, not the instructors, not the recruits, not even those 4 men who now sat shackled by their own shame. To them she was just another face in the crowd, but in her chest the conflict burned. Had she done the right thing? Or had she jeopardized months of careful cover work just to teach a handful of arrogant men a single lesson? The day stretched on, drills, marches, classroom lectures. Nobody mentioned the gym. The 4 men avoided her, kept their distance, but every now and then she caught them looking. Quick glances, eyes filled with something unspoken, part fear, part curiosity, part respect. By evening, the silence was heavier than the confrontation itself. And then it broke. Ella was eating alone again when the sound of boots scraped against the floor. Tank's voice came, low and uncertain. "Mind if we sit?" She didn't look up immediately. She let the silence hang just long enough to remind them that she wasn't cornered anymore. When she did meet their eyes, her gaze was steady. "That depends. Are you here to apologize or to cause more problems?" Hammer's words tumbled out quickly. "Apologize, definitely apologize." "Then sit." They slid onto the bench opposite her, awkward, shoulders hunched like schoolboys caught cheating on a test. Their food trays clattered softly as they set them down, but none of them touched the food. Their focus was on her. Tank cleared his throat. "We wanted to say we're sorry. What we did was out of line." "Yes," Ella said evenly, "it was." They shifted uncomfortably, waiting for her to say more. She didn't. She let the silence weigh on them, let it pull the words out of their mouths. Bull leaned forward. "We're going to change. We'll treat everyone with respect. Doesn't matter size, gender, background. Crusher nodded quickly. We'll remember everyone here volunteered. We'll stop assuming we know who belongs and who doesn't. Hammer finished the chorus. We'll stop assuming weakness just because of appearances. Ella studied their faces. Their words weren't polished. Their voices weren't steady. But there was something genuine in their eyes, shame, yes, but also a flicker of something better, something like resolve. Apology accepted, she said finally. But understand something. This wasn't about me being tough or you being weak. It was about the choices you made. You chose intimidation. You chose arrogance. You chose to use what you had, size numbers, against someone you thought couldn't fight back. Do you understand that? Tank nodded. We get it now, we really do. Good, because in the Navy you'll serve with people bigger than you, smaller than you, tougher than you, quieter than you. Your job won't be to dominate them. It will be to protect them, to stand beside them, to fight for them. If you can't respect them, you can't serve with them. The table went quiet again, but this time it wasn't shame filling the silence. It was thought, reflection. Ella finished her meal, stood, and lifted her tray. Remember this. Strength doesn't prove itself by crushing others. It proves itself by protecting them. She walked away, her boots striking the floor in steady rhythm, leaving 4 men sitting in silence, changed in ways they hadn't expected. For the first time, Tank didn't feel like the biggest man in the room. He felt small, humbled. But in that humility, something stirred, a different kind of strength. A strength that wasn't measured in pounds lifted or opponents pinned. A strength measured in respect, restraint, responsibility. And as Ella disappeared through the door, each of them felt the same uneasy truth. They had been given a second chance. She could have ruined them. She could have ended their careers before they began. Instead, she had handed them something far more dangerous, the burden of becoming better men. That night, long after lights out, Tank lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. He whispered into the darkness, "We just got our asses handed to us by someone we don't understand." From the other bunks, voices murmured agreement. Bull, Hammer, Crusher, none of them could sleep. Because none of them could forget. And deep inside, Ella lay awake too, her cover intact but her mind restless. She had planted a seed, but what would grow from it, that was still a mystery. Why did they start holding doors for people the very next morning? Why did they begin standing taller, quieter, as if waiting to prove something? The shift was small at first, subtle, almost invisible to the instructors. But Ella saw it immediately. She was trained to see the details no one else noticed. In the weeks that followed the gym incident, those 4 men, once loud, brash, mocking, began to move differently. Tank still had the size, Hammer still had the fists, Bull still had the linebacker's frame, and Crusher still looked like he could bend steel. But the edge in their voices was gone. The swagger softened. The laughter turned from cruel to cautious. They began volunteering for extra duties, cleaning gear without complaint, helping carry supplies during field exercises. And when other recruits started to stumble, gasping during runs, struggling under heavy packs, failing push-up counts, the 4 who had once mocked weakness now stepped in to help. Hammer lifted a smaller recruit onto his shoulders during a muddy obstacle course. Bull quietly corrected another's shooting stance at the firing range, patient where he once would have mocked. Crusher carried an injured classmate across the drill field without being asked. And Tank, the loudest, the most arrogant, began silencing others when they tried to belittle someone who was slower, weaker, or different. His voice carried weight, and this time it wasn't used to bully, but to stop bullying. Ella watched it all with professional detachment. She had been tasked with observing recruits, cataloging patterns, identifying problems within the training pipeline. This was exactly the kind of transformation the Navy needed, arrogance turning into leadership, cruelty turning into mentorship. But she also watched with something deeper, something she didn't want to admit, pride. At night in her bunk, she asked herself questions she couldn't write into her report. Was change real? Or was it temporary, born out of fear of exposure? Were they acting better only because she hadn't destroyed their careers? Or had the lesson truly taken root? And most dangerously of all, did it matter that she wanted them to succeed? Because that wasn't her mission. Her mission was evaluation. Cold, objective, classified. Yet she found herself rooting for them, willing them to hold on to the changes, to prove that people could grow if given the chance. Still, the cover she carried weighed heavy. She moved through each day as just another recruit, average times, average scores, quiet presence. But she felt their eyes on her sometimes. Not hostile anymore, curious, respectful, wondering. It was Tank who finally broke the silence. 3 weeks after the gym, during a classroom break, he approached her. His voice was low, cautious, stripped of arrogance. "Can I ask you something?" Ella didn't look up from her notes right away. She let him linger in uncertainty, then glanced at him. "Depends on the question." Tank hesitated, scratching at the edge of his desk like a boy caught cheating. "Are you really here to be evaluated, or are you here to evaluate us?" Her stomach tightened. The words were casual enough, but the meaning was sharp. He had noticed. He had been paying attention. She forced her expression neutral. "What makes you ask that?" He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Little things, the way you watch everything, the way you ask questions that aren't about passing tests but about how things are done, the way you handled," he stopped himself, lowering his voice even more, "the way you handled that night." Ella's pen stilled on the paper. She kept her breathing even. "Those are interesting observations," she said carefully. "I've been doing research," he admitted. "Navy SEALs sometimes run undercover tests, red team assessments. They go into programs to find flaws, vulnerabilities, weaknesses. Is that what you're doing here?" Her pulse flickered. He wasn't supposed to know that term, not as a recruit, not yet. She had underestimated him. Tank leaned closer, his voice rough with guilt. "If that's what you're doing, then I want you to know that what happened that night, that wasn't the program. That wasn't the instructors. That was just 4 idiots making terrible decisions." He was trying to protect the Navy, trying to defend the integrity of the very program he had nearly shamed. And that, more than anything, caught her off guard. Ella gave him the smallest of smiles, just enough to ease his fear. "Noted." But Tank wasn't finished. His voice softened, his eyes carrying something more than shame now. "And I want you to know we learned. We're better because of what you taught us." She met his gaze, reading him the way she had been trained to read suspects, allies, targets. He wasn't lying. He wasn't performing. He meant it. And that scared her more than their fists ever had, because it meant she wasn't just observing anymore. She was influencing, changing the very data she was sent to collect. That night she lay awake staring at the ceiling of the barracks, the silence pressing heavy. She thought about her orders: 4 weeks, observe, record, report. Do not intervene, do not reveal, do not shape the outcomes. But she had intervened, she had revealed, she had shaped them. Her cover still held, but barely. Tank's suspicion meant others could follow. If word reached the instructors, her mission would be compromised. And yet, could she regret what she'd done? Watching those 4 men transform, watching them stand taller not with arrogance but with responsibility, wasn't that part of the mission too? Not written on paper, not in the orders, but in the spirit of what the Navy was meant to build. She exhaled softly in the dark. Maybe the line between mission and humanity wasn't as clear as command wanted it to be. The next day, the 4 of them approached her during training, subtle, quiet. Not to threaten, not to corner, but to ask questions. How had she stayed calm that night? How had she known what to do? How did someone so small seem so unshakable? She deflected. She offered vague answers: training, experience, nothing specific, but the truth pressed against her ribs like a secret she could barely contain. Because the truth was simple. She had lived through fire they couldn't imagine. She had walked through alleys where shadows hid rifles, flown into zones where every rooftop might hide a sniper, fought in rooms smaller than that gym against men more dangerous than any recruit would ever be. And that truth, heavy, classified, carved into her bones, could never be told. Not here, not yet. But the change she was seeing in them, the quiet shift from arrogance to respect that she could witness, that she could allow herself to be proud of. And deep down, she knew, the real battle wasn't fought in deserts or jungles. Sometimes it was fought in quiet gyms, in chow halls, in barracks bunks where men chose who they would become. And for the first time since her assignment began, Ella wondered if maybe her cover had been broken for a reason. Because sometimes the most important missions weren't about secrets. Sometimes they were about change. Why was she hesitating to write what she had seen? Her orders were simple: observe, document, report. But every time Ella sat with the blank evaluation form in front of her, pen poised, she stopped. The gym incident should have been at the center of her report, an undeniable breach of conduct. 4 men intimidating a woman in an isolated space. A case study in toxic behavior that could have been catastrophic if left unchecked. And yet, she hadn't written a word about it. The rest of her notes were clean, precise, clinical. Observations on drill instructors' methods, weak points in safety protocols, inefficiencies in scheduling, even small morale issues that could snowball under pressure. All useful, all objective, all safe. But the gym, no, not yet. Because to write it down would mean explaining how it ended. And to explain how it ended would mean breaking her cover, revealing abilities no average recruit should possess. The mission had been clear from the start: anonymity above all else. She wasn't there to stand out. She was there to blend in so fully that no one would ever think to question her. But she had been questioned. Tank's eyes haunted her, that look of realization when he had asked if she was undercover. He hadn't pressed further, but the suspicion lingered. The others, too, stole glances when they thought she wasn't looking, as though waiting for her to slip, to reveal the truth. Every day that passed brought her closer to the end of the assignment. And every day the question grew heavier. Did she tell the truth in her report, or did she protect her cover and let the incident vanish into silence? It wasn't just her future at stake, it was theirs. The 4 men had changed. Everyone could see it now. They weren't just following orders anymore, they were stepping into roles they had mocked weeks earlier. Tank volunteered to lead firewatch shifts without complaint. Hammer broke up a brewing fight between recruits before it could escalate. Bull spent evenings tutoring others who struggled with written exams. Crusher, once the loudest, now carried himself with quiet humility. Instructors noticed. Other recruits noticed. Even Ella noticed, though she tried to tell herself it didn't matter. But it did. Because the question wasn't whether they had made a mistake. The question was whether they had learned from it. And watching them now, she couldn't deny that they had. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the training fields, Tank approached her quietly. No swagger, no arrogance, just a man carrying a question he had been afraid to ask. "Are you going to include that night in your report?" Ella didn't answer right away. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, letting the silence stretch. "What makes you think I'd mention it?" "Because it happened," he said softly. "And because it was wrong, you'd have every reason to, and we'd deserve it." She turned to him then, studying his face. There was no fear there, not anymore, just acceptance, the look of someone prepared to take responsibility. "Tank," she said quietly, "if I include it, it won't just reflect on you. It'll reflect on the program, the instructors, the Navy itself. Do you understand that?" "I do." His jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed steady. "But I also know you're here for a reason. If that reason means writing the truth, then write it. Just please also write that we learned, that we changed, that we didn't stay those idiots who cornered you in the gym." His voice cracked slightly at the end, a trace of something rare in him: humility. Ella exhaled slowly. "Noted." The word echoed between them, carrying more weight than it should. The next days passed in a blur of training drills, inspections, and tests. The four men pushed themselves harder than anyone else. It wasn't just about graduating now. It was about proving, perhaps only to themselves, that they had become different men. And Ella, she kept her cover. She remained the quiet recruit who never finished first, never drew attention. But inside, she felt the pull of two competing missions, the one written in her orders and the one unfolding in front of her eyes. On her final night, she sat alone at her desk, the evaluation form before her. The lamp cast a yellow circle of light, pages filled with her handwriting. She had documented everything, everything except the gym. Her pen hovered. She could write it down now. She could end the doubt, preserve the incident forever in official records, but her hand stayed still. Because she remembered the apology in the chow hall, the way Tank's voice had carried when he told others to stop mocking weaker recruits, the sight of Hammer tutoring someone instead of teasing them, the pride in Bull's face when his bunkmate finally passed a strength test because of his encouragement, Crusher kneeling beside a struggling recruit on the obstacle course, whispering, "You've got this." She remembered, too, Tank's voice at sunset, "Just write that we learned." Her pen touched the paper, then lifted again. No, she wouldn't write it, not because it hadn't happened, but because something greater had happened afterward. And sometimes the lesson that followed mattered more than the mistake itself. Instead, she wrote this. Recruits demonstrated the ability to learn from failures, adapt behavior, and develop into positive influences for their peers. Recommend formal integration of peer-to-peer correction and mentorship into training curriculum. She set the pen down. The report was complete. The next morning, word spread quickly that Ella was leaving. Assignments rotated, recruits shifted, faces disappeared as new ones arrived. But for four men, the news carried weight. They found her before she could go, gathered in the courtyard. Their faces were solemn, their words halting. "We wanted to thank you," Hammer began. "For what?" she asked evenly. "For not destroying us," Bull admitted. "For giving us a chance to be better," Crusher added. Tank's voice was last, quiet but steady. "For teaching us that strength isn't about size, it's about responsibility." Ella studied them, reading them one last time. They stood now, shoulders squared not with arrogance but with respect. They had grown, each in their own way. She felt a flicker of something she rarely allowed herself on missions: hope. "You taught yourselves," she said softly. "I just gave you the reason to start." "Will we ever see you again?" Tank asked. She allowed herself a small smile. "The Navy's smaller than you think, who knows?" And with that she turned, her boots striking against the concrete, her cover intact, her mission complete. But as she walked away from Naval Station Great Lakes, her thoughts lingered. She had chosen silence over exposure, forgiveness over punishment. It wasn't what the orders had said, but sometimes orders weren't enough. Because sometimes the greatest victories weren't written in reports. Sometimes they lived in the quiet changes of people who had been given a second chance. Why did the letter make her stop moving? She had carried messages before, coded cables, mission updates, orders marked classified in red across the top. But this envelope, thin and ordinary, carried a different kind of weight. It had arrived 6 months after she walked away from Great Lakes. She was stationed at another facility now, her cover assignment nearly identical: observe, evaluate, report. Same classrooms, same drills, same young recruits stumbling through the threshold of military life. She had been slipping quietly through the background as always, eyes sharp, notes steady. Another faceless figure in a sea of uniforms. And then the letter came. It was forwarded through official channels, the return address scrawled in bold handwriting she recognized immediately: Williams, Tank. She hesitated before opening it, holding the paper between her fingers like it might burn. She had left him behind, left all of them behind. That was the rhythm of her work: enter quietly, leave quietly, erase yourself from their story. but now their story had found her. She unfolded the pages. His words were uneven, the handwriting rough, but the message clear. He wrote about the destroyer where he now served, the Pacific waters stretching endless and blue. He wrote about his 3 friends, how they had all graduated from basic with honors, surprising even themselves. He wrote about the way they carried the lesson she had given them, not just in memory, but in action. They had started an informal mentorship program on their ship, helping new sailors adapt to military life. When hazing crept in, they stamped it out. When arrogance surfaced, they reminded others what arrogance could cost. They weren't saints, they were still learning, still stumbling, but they were different, better. At the bottom of the letter, Tank's words grew almost hesitant. "Thank you for showing us what Navy training really means." Ella sat on the edge of her bunk, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. She exhaled slowly, her chest tightening in a way that caught her off guard. She had taught lessons before, lessons delivered through orders, tactics, briefings. Lessons in survival, in combat, in discipline. But this was different. Because this was proof. Proof that sometimes the smallest battles, the ones fought not with weapons but with choices, could ripple outward farther than she would ever see. For a long moment she just sat there, staring at the letter, the sounds of the facility moving faintly around her. Recruits shouting cadence in the courtyard, boots striking pavement, the clatter of trays in the mess hall, life going on, and in her hands the reminder that sometimes life went on differently because of you. She folded the letter carefully and slid it into the small folder she kept for personal items. A folder thinner than most, nearly empty. A photograph of her parents, a ribbon from a training graduation years earlier, a single page torn from a field manual she had carried through her first deployment. And now, Tank's letter. She hadn't planned to keep it. She never kept much. But this, she realized, wasn't just about her. This was about what people could become when given the chance. Her new recruits didn't know who she was, of course. To them she was still the quiet one, average scores, no reason to stand out. But when she saw arrogance rise in a classroom or mocking laughter echo across the field, she remembered the 4 men who had once surrounded her in a gym. And she reminded herself that arrogance could be unlearned, that cruelty could be reshaped. Not every recruit would change. Some never did. Some washed out, some carried their pride like armor until it cracked under pressure. But others could be given the chance. That night, lying in her bunk, Ella turned the words over in her mind again and again. "Thank you for showing us what Navy training really means." She thought about what training meant. Not just pull-ups, runs, shooting ranges. Training wasn't just about building stronger bodies. It was about building stronger people. People who could serve not only with skill but with integrity. And she wondered, was that her true mission? Not the classified reports, not the red-stamped paperwork, but something quieter, something harder to measure. She remembered the look on Tank's face the night he asked if she would include the gym in her report. The fear, the humility, the hope. She had chosen not to write it, chosen to let the lesson live only in them. And now, half a world away, that choice was reshaping other sailors. The Navy would never know. Command would never record it, but she would know. Weeks passed, her days blending into the rhythm of drills and debriefings. But the letter never left her thoughts. Sometimes, in the middle of a long march, she would hear Tank's voice in her head. "We learned." And it kept her steady, even on nights when exhaustion pressed down heavy and the loneliness of undercover work gnawed at her. Because undercover work was lonely, always moving, always silent, always watching from the edges. Friendships weren't real, bonds weren't allowed. Every face she passed would be gone in weeks, replaced by new ones, and she had accepted that. But Tank's letter proved something else. Even in that silence, even in that loneliness, the impact could last. She found herself replaying moments she hadn't thought about in months. Bull gasping for air on the gym floor. Hammer staring at his numb hand in disbelief. Crusher doubled over, his pride shattered. Tank pinned beneath her knee, his eyes wide not with pain but with realization. And then the morning after, their voices halting, their apologies genuine, the way they sat with her in the chow hall like chastened children, words spilling from their mouths not because they were forced, but because they needed to be said. It hadn't been just a confrontation, it had been a turning point. Ella closed her eyes, remembering the way she had walked away that final day, boots striking the ground, the courtyard shrinking behind her. She had thought then that she would never see them again, and maybe she wouldn't, but seeing them wasn't the point. The point was knowing that they had carried something forward. And in the strange, quiet corners of her work, that was enough. Weeks later, during a training evaluation at yet another base, she found herself in a classroom with recruits buzzing around her. The instructor barked orders, notebooks flipped, pens scratched. Ella sat quietly, blending as always. But across the room, a tall recruit mocked a smaller one for asking a question. The laughter rippled, sharp and unkind. Ella's gaze sharpened. For a moment she almost rose, almost stepped in, but then something unexpected happened. Another recruit stood up instead. He turned on the joker, his voice steady. "Knock it off. We're all here to learn. You don't know who's going to save your life one day." The laughter died instantly. Ella felt a flicker of something inside her, pride, hope, maybe both, because she realized she didn't need to step in this time. Someone else already had. And maybe that was the real mission. Not just to be the hand that stopped arrogance, but to be the spark that made others do it too. She thought of the letter again. "Thank you for showing us what Navy training really means." Maybe she hadn't just changed 4 men. Maybe she had started something that would echo farther than she would ever see. She tucked the thought away, quiet and steady, like the letter in her folder. And when she lay down that night, she let herself believe something she hadn't dared believe in years. That sometimes, even in silence, even in secrecy, even in shadows, you could leave the world better than you found it. Why did she always start with a question? Maybe because questions made people lean in. Maybe because answers weren't as powerful if they came too quickly. What do you do when you encounter 4 hostile opponents in a confined space? The room fell quiet. 20 recruits, fresh-faced, shoulders stiff in nervous anticipation, stared at her. They weren't sure if it was a trick question or if she expected them to give some textbook answer. A few hands rose hesitantly. Neutralize them quickly. Use superior tactics. Target the most dangerous one first. Eliminate the threats before they can coordinate. Ella listened, nodding slightly, her face unreadable. All technically correct answers, but not the complete answer. She let the silence stretch, tension growing until the recruits shifted in their seats. Then she spoke, her voice low, deliberate. What if neutralizing them isn't the mission? What if the mission is making sure they never become threats to anyone again? Confused expressions rippled across the room. Recruits looked at each other, unsure. She could see the unease, the way they wanted clarity, the way they weren't prepared for a question that didn't have a tactical answer. Ella walked slowly across the room, boots striking the floor in measured rhythm. She kept her voice calm but sharp. In combat, we neutralize threats. That's survival. But in training, in leadership, sometimes the mission isn't just to end the fight. Sometimes it's to end the reason the fight started in the first place. She stopped at the front of the room, her gaze sweeping across them. Strength isn't just about force. It's about transformation. Ask yourselves this: are you warriors or are you leaders? The room was silent. No one moved, and that was good, because silence meant they were thinking. Ella didn't tell them the whole story, not the details, not the part where 4 men had circled her in a gym, laughing until fear replaced it, not the 43 seconds that ended with them on the ground. That was classified. That was personal. But she told them enough. Enough for them to understand that victory wasn't always measured by who fell, but by who stood afterward, different, changed, better. She carried that story with her like a shadow. Years had passed since Great Lakes, but the lesson never left her. She never named tank, hammer, bull, or crusher. She never described the smell of sweat and rubber mats, the look of disbelief on their faces. She only told the part that mattered, that 4 men, once arrogant, had become leaders not because she broke them, but because she gave them the chance to rebuild themselves. Sometimes she wondered what they would think if they knew their story was being told, not by name, but as a lesson whispered into the minds of new recruits. Would they be embarrassed, proud, both? She hoped the latter. When she had received Tank's letter, she hadn't known it would become a cornerstone of her teaching philosophy. But as she stood in front of those young faces, she realized that was exactly what it had become. She had lived through firefights, missions where seconds meant survival, assignments so deep in cover that her name vanished from rosters. But when she thought about what mattered most, it wasn't those battles. It was a gym, a mistake, and the choice that followed. Because the truth was this, she could have destroyed them. She could have written the report, had them disciplined, ended their Navy careers before they began. But she hadn't. She had chosen silence, chosen patience, chosen the harder path of letting them prove themselves. And that choice had rippled outward into mentorship programs on ships, into leadership moments that shaped other sailors, into the letter that had made her stop moving all those months ago. Now it rippled again, through these recruits staring at her, their young minds stretching to grasp something bigger than drills and exercises. Warriors fight, she said softly. Leaders transform. The Navy needs both. But remember this, when you have the power to crush, you also have the power to build. Which one you choose will define the kind of sailor you become. One of the recruits, a young woman with sharp eyes, raised her hand. But ma'am, what if they don't change? What if they don't learn? Ella's gaze softened. It was the right question, the hard question. Then you do what you must, she answered. You protect yourself. You protect others. You neutralize the threat. But don't forget, sometimes people surprise you. Sometimes the enemy today is the ally tomorrow. And sometimes the choice you make gives them the chance to surprise themselves. The young woman lowered her hand slowly, the answer settling deep. Ella let the silence linger again before dismissing them. Boots scraped against the floor, chairs clattered back, voices rose in murmurs as the recruits filed out. But she stayed behind for a moment, standing in the quiet room, memories flickering like ghosts. The gym, the circle, Tank's voice mocking, her own voice calm, the sudden shift when laughter turned to fear, the apology, the letter. She closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her, then exhaled. Sometimes the smallest missions left the deepest scars. And sometimes the scars weren't wounds at all, they were reminders. Later that evening, alone in her quarters, Ella opened the thin folder again. She unfolded Tank's letter, reading the words she already knew by heart. She thought about where he was now, where Hammer, Bull, and Crusher might be. Were they still carrying the lesson forward? Were they still shaping others the way she had shaped them? She hoped so. Because the Navy was a web of stories, thousands of threads crossing and recrossing, binding strangers together in missions, in battles, in lessons. And if those 4 men had become better leaders, then every sailor they touched carried a piece of that night in the gym too, even if they never knew it. Ella folded the letter again, sliding it carefully back into the folder. She placed it beneath the photograph of her parents, beneath the ribbon, beneath the torn field manual page. Not because it was less important, but because it belonged at the foundation. A root, a beginning. She turned off the light, the room sinking into shadow. Outside, the base was alive with the sounds of drills, boots, orders, shouts. The rhythm of training, endless and loud. But inside, she let herself rest in the quiet. Because she knew something few others did. That sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in deserts or jungles or oceans. Sometimes they were fought in gyms, in chow halls, in the quiet spaces where arrogance met humility and people chose who they would become. And as she closed her eyes, Ella carried the truth with her like armor. The real victory wasn't the 43 seconds that ended with 4 men on the ground. The real victory was what happened after. Why did the story travel so far? Why did whispers of a nameless recruit's lesson echo in training halls she had never stepped foot in? Ella never intended it. She had told the story sparingly, carefully disguised, always focusing on the moral, never the details. She spoke of 4 hostile opponents in a confined space, of the choice to crush or to transform. But she never mentioned names, dates, or locations. To her recruits, it was a parable. To her, it was memory. And yet the story spread. At first it lived only in the minds of the candidates she trained. They carried it into the fleet, repeating fragments to their own crews. Sometimes it came out in mess halls, told between bites of cold eggs and burnt coffee. Sometimes it emerged in tense moments at sea, when tempers flared and arrogance threatened to fracture a unit. A petty officer would murmur, "Remember what we learned in training. Strength isn't just crushing, it's protecting." A junior sailor, mocked for weakness, would snap back, "You don't know who someone really is. Don't underestimate them." The words weren't always exact, but the lesson was the same. And slowly, like water carving stone, it reshaped the culture around them. Months turned into years. Other instructors began using the scenario in classrooms, 4-on-1 confined space, limited options. They asked their recruits the same question Ella had asked. What do you do? The answers were always predictable: eliminate, neutralize, destroy. And then the instructors, having borrowed the story secondhand, would offer the twist. What if the mission is to transform instead of eliminate? Confused recruits would frown, struggling with the paradox. And in that struggle, they began to grow. Ella heard about it slowly, through whispers, through fragments. A young officer she'd never trained mentioned the 4 opponents story as if it were common knowledge. A chaplain referenced it in a sermon about restraint. A memo circulated in leadership training circles, citing transformational engagement as a new framework for developing sailors. She never corrected anyone, never claimed ownership. That wasn't the point. The story was never hers to keep. It belonged to the Navy now. What mattered wasn't who told it. What mattered was that it was told. She watched the ripple effect with quiet astonishment. An idea born in the silence of a gym, tested in 43 seconds, was now shaping leadership courses across service branches. Not just the Navy, Marines, Air Force, Army, even the Coast Guard. Some called it the principle, though few knew the name behind it. Others called it strategic transformation. Still others simply referred to it as the 4-on-1 question. The labels didn't matter. The meaning did. One evening, years after that night in Great Lakes, Ella found herself sitting in the back of a seminar for junior officers. She wasn't teaching, not that day. She was simply observing, blending as she always had. The instructor at the front posed the familiar question. What do you do when you encounter 4 hostile opponents in a confined space? Ella's chest tightened. She leaned forward slightly, listening as hands shot up. The answers came: neutralize, subdue, eliminate. Then came the pause, the twist. The same words she had spoken years earlier. What if the mission is to make sure they never become threats again? She watched the young faces shift, confusion, then reflection. She recognized it. She had seen it dozens of times in dozens of rooms, and still it moved her. Because she realized then, this wasn't just a story anymore. It was a doctrine, a way of thinking. A seed she had planted without meaning to, now grown into something far larger than herself. When the seminar ended, the instructor approached her quietly, not realizing who she was. What did you think? Ella smiled faintly. It was good. Have you heard that scenario before? She paused, choosing her words carefully. Once or twice. He chuckled. It's everywhere now. They say it started with some classified evaluation years back. No one knows who the recruit was, but the lesson stuck. She only nodded, her smile tight, her heart steady. No one knows. And that was how it had to be. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Ella opened her thin folder again. The letter was still there, worn at the creases, Tank's rough handwriting fading with time. She ran her fingers over the words, remembering his voice, remembering the humility in his eyes. "Thank you for showing us what Navy training really means." She wondered if he knew, if any of them knew. Did Tank realize his letter had become part of something larger? Did Hammer, Bull, Crusher understand that their failure had become a lesson whispered across the fleet? That their change had become proof of possibility? Maybe they didn't, maybe they never would, and maybe that was for the best. Ella folded the letter carefully, slid it back into place, and sat in the silence. She had fought many battles, some with rifles, some with fists, some with shadows. But this was the strangest battle of all. A battle against arrogance, against cruelty, against the smallness in people that made them use strength the wrong way. And the victory wasn't hers, it was theirs. Because the truth was this: she had only lit the spark. They had chosen to carry it, and others had chosen to carry it further still. That was leadership. Not just commanding in the moment, but creating ripples that moved long after you were gone. And so, in the quiet of her room, Ella allowed herself one rare smile. Not for herself, but for what had been born in that gym, for what had grown far beyond her reach. Sometimes the greatest missions weren't the ones written in orders. Sometimes they were the ones no one ever knew you carried out. And sometimes, just sometimes, the story of 4 arrogant men and 1 quiet recruit could become a legacy. Why did she still think about it after all these years? Not the 43 seconds, not the fight itself, but the silence after. The way 4 men sat on a gym floor, breathing heavy, pride shattered, futures dangling in the balance. The way they chose in that silence to change. Ella stood at the edge of the training field, the California sun spilling gold across. The Naval Special Warfare Center hummed with energy, recruits pushing through obstacle courses, instructors barking orders, the ocean crashing against the shore in the distance. She had walked these grounds as a ghost before. Now she walked them as a senior instructor. Her hair was streaked with silver now, lines etched around her eyes, but her gaze was as sharp as ever, her voice steady, her presence commanding without effort. She had lived a life most would never know, missions written in ink that faded, operations buried in files stamped classified. And yet when recruits looked at her, they saw something simpler. A woman who had walked their path before, who knew what it cost, and who still carried herself with quiet strength. She gathered them in a classroom, young faces shining with eagerness and exhaustion, shoulders squared with determination. She began as she always did. What do you do when you encounter 4 hostile opponents in a confined space? The answers came as they always did: eliminate, subdue, neutralize, tactical precision, correct but incomplete. And as always, she delivered the question that cut deeper. What if neutralizing them isn't the mission? What if the mission is making sure they never become threats again? Some recruits blinked, confused. Some frowned, searching for the hidden meaning. Others leaned forward, hungry to understand. Ella watched them all, her chest tight with a familiar ache. Because this wasn't just a lesson anymore. It was a legacy. She told them fragments of the story, never names, never details, just the heartbeat of the moment. A recruit once faced 4 opponents. She could have destroyed them. She could have reported them. She could have ended their futures. Instead, she chose differently, and that choice changed everything. She described how arrogance had melted into humility, how cruelty had been reshaped into leadership, how those 4 men had gone on to serve with distinction, mentoring others, protecting instead of mocking, building instead of breaking. The recruits listened in silence, some nodding, some still frowning, but all of them leaning into the weight of her words, because they sensed it wasn't just theory, it was lived truth. And when the lesson ended, when they filed out into the sunlight, she stood alone in the empty room, the ghosts of the past whispering around her. Tank, Hammer, Bull, Crusher. She hadn't spoken their names in years, but she still remembered their faces the morning after the gym. She still remembered the letter Tank had written, his rough handwriting etched into her memory. "Thank you for showing us what Navy training really means." She wondered sometimes where they were now. Chief petty officers, senior leaders, retired, maybe gone. The Navy was unforgiving and not all stories had happy endings, but she liked to believe they were still carrying the lesson. That somewhere on some deck or in some briefing room they were reminding others of the truth she had given them. Strength isn't domination. Strength is responsibility. The sun dipped lower, the sky burning orange. Ella walked slowly along the training field, recruits shouting cadence in the distance. Her steps were steady, each one echoing with years of service, years of silence, years of lessons lived and carried forward. She thought about the missions she would never speak of, the nights in hostile cities, the days spent behind the glass of cover identities. She thought about the times she had fired her weapon, the times she hadn't, the moments when hesitation would have killed her, and the moments when restraint had saved lives. But of all those memories, it was still the gym that came back to her most often, because that was where she had learned, maybe more than anywhere else, that victory wasn't about ending a fight. It was about changing what came after. Years later, as she prepared to leave the Navy for good, her students gathered to honor her. They spoke of her toughness, her discipline, her calm under pressure. But the ones who had truly listened, the ones who had carried her lesson into the fleet, spoke of something else. She taught us that strength isn't just about combat. She taught us that leadership is about transformation. She taught us that sometimes the hardest choice isn't to fight, but to forgive. Ella listened quietly, her hands folded, her face composed. She didn't need applause. She didn't need medals. She had carried her mission in silence, and silence was enough. But as she walked away from one final time, the Pacific wind sharp against her face, she allowed herself a thought she rarely entertained. That maybe, just maybe, the smallest missions had been the most important after all. Because sometimes the Navy measured victory in battles won, in enemies subdued, in territories secured. But Ella had come to measure it differently. In men who grew where arrogance once lived. In recruits who carried forward respect instead of ridicule. In a culture reshaped by a story no one fully knew. She paused at the water's edge, the waves crashing endlessly, the horizon wide and unforgiving. She thought of the recruits she had trained, the sailors they had become, the lives they would go on to touch. She thought of the night in the gym, the letter, the countless times the story had been told in rooms she would never see. And she understood, finally, what her true mission had always been. Not to fight every battle, not to expose every flaw, not even to win every war, but to leave behind a lesson that would outlive her. She turned from the ocean, her boots pressing into the sand, her body weary but her spirit steady. The Navy would move on without her. It always did. But the story, the lesson, would remain. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.